My name is Joy Fallon. I'm the senior minister at King's Chapel, where Betsy has been a member for many years. So we are delighted to be co-sponsoring this with Beacon Hill Village. As you know, when you normally have your conversations with, you hold it in our parlor. So we want to just welcome you with that in mind as well. Pretend we're all in that space together. Betsy, during her time at King's Chapel, has held virtually every leadership role on our elected boards, and she just finished chairing the committee that is made up of all the chairs of all the committees, because she is that kind of leader for us, and we're very grateful. And I, in particular, having served as the minister there for now 7 years, I asked her very early on to serve on the committee that supports me personally, because I trust her wisdom and her judgment, and I'm eternally grateful for all that she does for us and for many other organizations such as Beacon Hill Village. The thing is, I knew Betsy for a long time before I had any idea that she had served in this extraordinary role at Yale. To have been a woman who was 31 years of age and to be the first woman dean at Yale College at a time when they were going through a huge change, bringing that first class of women in, I think is extraordinary. But she is modest and she will rarely puff herself up. So it's our duty to do that, Anne, today, to just tell the story for all of you who were at Yale, and also just to really, it's just an honor for me to know Betsy. Of course, she went on from there to do more things. She was an attorney at a time when there were few women attorneys, and I know that because I was an attorney who came after Betsy. And she also has written one of the most wonderful books about Alzheimer's and teaches me constantly about how to minister to those and their families who are suffering from that. So for many, many reasons, I'm grateful to Betsy, and it's an honor to be hearing from her and from Anne today. I love the book, Anne. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Karen Garvin, chair of Beacon Hill Village's program committee. I'm delighted we're able to share this evening's event with members of King's Chapel and Beacon Hill Village. We thank you all for joining us. As you know, or as you may know, the village's fundamental goal is helping its members lead vibrant, healthy, and independent lives as they age in the neighborhoods they love. We do so by offering choices of the many services we offer, the many programs geared to strengthen the body, stimulate the mind and the soul, and shape the community. In these days of COVID-19, we are working to reassure our members of our continuing services, and we are reinventing ourselves to offer the information and the programs that our members expect. Tonight is just such a program, a fine program which, rather than person to person, is virtual, so we can maintain social distancing and still enjoy the company of friends while enjoying the excellent conversation about the first women of Yale College. Our own Betsy Peterson has had a full career as an educator, an administrator, a lawyer, and an author. Her book, The Voices of Alzheimer's, as Joy Fallon mentioned, is a wonderful, wonderful book. She's also a community volunteer, Beacon Hill Seminars, Beacon Hill Village, and King's Chapel. She still finds time to bird watch, hike, and be with family, and sometimes to whitewater raft down the Grand Canyon. So that is our Betsy Peterson. Her fellow presenter is Ann Perkins, an award-winning historian and an expert on higher education. She was a Rhodes Scholar and received both master's and PhDs in education from Harvard and the University of Massachusetts. Yale Needs Women is Ann's first book, in which she explains how the college's first female students demonstrated It was one thing to let women through the door, but quite another to make them feel welcome, integrated, and equally represented in Yale's culture. Now to these two fine women and an interesting story. First, Anne, who will give us some background on the book. Anne, you're on.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you, Joy, and many thanks to Beacon Hill Village and to King's Chapel for sponsoring this conversation tonight about that moment in our nation's history when America's top colleges, when Yale and its peers finally admitted their first women students. So as Karen and Charlie said, what I'm going to do is just give you a brief 5-minute overview so you understand the context into which Betsy Thomas Peterson, and I will sometimes probably slip and call her Betsy Thomas because as the historian, that's how I studied her. That was her name at Yale. And into the context in which she and those first women students arrived. And then Betsy and I will do sort of a live interview conversation in front of you and then turn it over to all of you to ask questions. So be thinking of some good ones and we'll look to end pretty much right on time at 7 o'clock. So to look at Yale at this time, let's turn back to September 1969. The world was churning. The Vietnam War was raging, as was the protest against it. The Black Power movement was challenging how Americans thought about race. The Stonewall riots, just that summer before those first women students arrived, had laid bare the discrimination faced by gay men and women. And the women's movement was just getting started. It was a moment in history not unlike this one, when individuals were standing up to challenge long-standing social injustice. And it's at that moment when coeducation begins at Yale. Now, as I said, the women's movement was just getting started, so let me give you some numbers to situate you. Just 7% of US doctors were women in 1969. Just 3% of US lawyers, just 2% of the members of Congress. Discrimination against women college administrators like Betsy, against women college faculty, against women college students was perfectly legal. None of the laws we have in place now were yet there. And the word sexism was so new that Time magazine was still putting it in quotes because no one had ever heard it before. And if you think Yale was the only college that had been turning women away, think again. You know, that list of colleges that were men only up through the late 60s, in fact, reads like an academic who's who, from Amherst College, Boston College, Bowdoin, Columbia, Dartmouth, and Duke at the start of the alphabet to UVA, West Point, Williams, Wesleyan, and of course Yale at its end. 7 of the 8 Ivy League colleges still turned women away, even 2 of our prestigious public universities. And so when Yale made the announcement that it was going co-ed, the news was so shocking that the New York Times printed it on the front page. 10 months later, Betsy Peterson, the first woman in the dean's office who wasn't a secretary, and those first women undergraduates arrived. And to picture Yale's campus at that time, don't picture a campus like the co-ed ones we think of today. Picture instead a village of men, a village of white men, to be precise. Those women undergraduates were limited in number because of a gender quota Yale put in place that gave preference to men. They were just 13% of the student body that first year. Of Yale's 407 tenured faculty members in 1969, 3 were women. And in the year before Betsy Peterson arrived, of the top 54 administrators in Yale's central administration and the administration of Yale College, 1 of those 54 was a woman. She was the associate librarian for technical services, hardly a position of power. But in the months between when Kingman Brewster, Yale's president, announced Yale was going co-ed and those first women arrived, Yale hired 2 women administrators. One of them was Elga Wasserman, who was given the unenviable task of overseeing Yale's transition to coeducation, and the other was Betsy Thomas Peterson. And with that, let me turn to you, Betsy. in writing Yale Needs Women, I conducted over 50 interviews and was also the beneficiary of another 30 interviews that others had done before me. But I'm a Boston resident, and I was so delighted to find that all of a sudden this assistant dean, this first woman in the dean's office at Yale, lived walking distance from my apartment. So it was, Betsy and I conducted a number of interviews as part of my writing this book, and coming to know her and others of these women who were at Yale at this time really has been a huge gift to me. So Betsy, why don't we just start with the most basic question, which is, here's this world of men, a place that has been all male since 1701, 268 years of men at Yale. Why did you want the job?
Well, I was actually working in an institution that had also been all male for hundreds of years. At the time, I was dean of the Andover summer session. Phillips Academy Andover had a summer program for students from an enrichment program. And it was an interesting job, very varied, but it was one that I wasn't going to do forever. And so I was kind of looking around for something else and saw that some colleges were going co-ed. And I thought, they might be interested in a woman who's been working at a boys' school. I should add that the summer session itself was coeducational, but the Andover, the main season was still strictly for boys until 5 or 6 years after I left. And I thought a state of experience that might be helpful. The other thing that appealed to me was that previously, both at Andover and the job I had before that at Brandeis, I got the job despite being a woman. And so, the thought that I may get a job because I was a woman was a little different.
And so you arrive at Yale, and literally you're getting there days before those first women students arrive, and you go to your office, and John Wilkinson comes in, I guess, mid-morning. And John was the associate dean at Yale College and has since become a treasured friend and colleague of Betsy's. But he was extremely concerned that very first morning. And why don't you tell the story of why?
John was dean of undergraduate affairs and my immediate boss, and he was stricken because Yale is, as many of you may know, has a college system. It's like the Harvard houses, if you're familiar with that, so that every student is a member of one of the, at the time, 12 colleges. And each of those colleges had a head who was at the time called a master and a dean. And the 12 college deans were sort of my counterparts. I was working entirely in the central dean's office, but each of them was a faculty member teaching or having some other responsibility besides being a college dean. So here are my closest colleagues I'm about to meet, and I can't go to the meeting because it's at Morey's, and Morey's was not admitting women. Morey's was a private club that used to be open to all Yale undergraduates, but the summer before coeducation, they changed it to be open to male undergraduates. And a little bit later, John came back hugely relieved because it turned out this meeting was in one of the upstairs private dining rooms, and women were allowed to go to meetings in the upstairs private dining rooms.
That situation at Morey's is not unlike what was going on in the nation as a whole, in that in every city, the most prestigious restaurants would often have what was called executive hours, where the men were there to conduct business and women were not allowed in the door. And that's what's going on at Yale. This Club Morey's was where Yale had its most important meetings. It's where the Board of Trustee members would come and have lunch. It's where the president, Kingman Brewster, would have lunch. It's where faculty meetings were held, recruiting was held. And they were able to get this small concession that if a group, like the dean's office, wanted to have a meeting and allow a woman to come, they had to pay an extra fee and have the meeting up on the second floor, so that they wouldn't bother the men by having a woman enter. Now, so just to continue, since we're talking about Morey's already, early on, you're appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Yale Co-op, which is the Yale bookstore then. And you learn, lo and behold, that they have their meetings at Morey's. So how did you handle that?
So I don't remember the first meeting, but I think I just went and felt pretty cross about it. I want to mention that the Yale College Dean's Office was quick to stop meeting at Morey's, but most of the other Yale departments were not. And so then perhaps the second meeting, I thought, well, I'll go to the meeting, but I don't want to give them any business. So I didn't order anything for lunch, and people noticed that I didn't order anything for lunch, and they figured out why I didn't order anything for lunch. So
And
then we had our meetings in the co-op office.
I love that. It's just such a subtle yet a very clear way of saying, if you want to keep eating here, you're going to have to be very uncomfortable because I'm not going to eat lunch. And clearly it was effective. That question of changing Maury's policy, if every group at Yale, like the Yale College Dean's Office, and after your influence, like the Yale Co-op Board, had just stopped going to Maury's, the policy would have changed instantly. But Yale men liked Maury's, and they kept patronizing it until finally a brilliant woman graduate of Yale Law School comes up with a strategy. And you were part of that as well. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, her Yale's Maury's liquor license was coming up for renewal, and this woman had the brilliant idea of challenging the renewal. And so several of us went up to Hartford to testify to the Connecticut Alcohol Commission, or whatever it was called. And it took the commission a while to make up its mind, but they eventually ended up revoking the license. In the meantime, there had been increasingly objections from students and faculty members, and some departments were stopping to, they were what's the word I want? People going into Maury's would be challenged. And it worked. Eventually it changed. But the problem was, it really was a convenient place to eat and have lunch and gather in a small group. The dean's office meetings were often in the college dining halls, which were kind of noisy and not very good for a group of 12 or 14 people.
Yeah. So let's turn to a different group that you were part of, and that was the Yale Admissions Committee. And you served on the Yale Admissions Committee your entire time at Yale. And do you want to talk a little bit about that process, and particularly what it was like serving on the Admissions Committee, given that Yale had this quota that limited women and gave preference to men? And for those of you, the exact numbers were, the idea was in what was largely thought to be Kingman Brewster's words, President Kingman Brewster's words, that Yale's responsibility was to graduate 1,000 male leaders a year. And that phrase, 1,000 male leaders, was one every single woman I interviewed knew. And so the women were kind of given the slots that were left over. So in that first entering class, there were 230 women. But what does that mean for you?
They weren't exactly leftover slots. They were slots crammed in. I mean, one of the reasons for the quota was that they didn't build, there were no instant new dormitories. There were just more people living in the same space, 500 more students living in the same space that had been there the year before. I want to say first that being on an admissions committee is really hard work. I was a staff member on the admissions committee at Brandeis for 2 years. You have all these great kids. They're such small circumstances that often make the difference between somebody getting in and not getting in, and they're going to take it really hard if they don't get in. So that in itself is tough. The meetings are long and arduous as you go through all these candidates, and to do that, we looked at the men separately from the women, and you'd go through it, you'd admit men, and then you go to the women, and there'd be wonderful candidates you couldn't take because there weren't enough spaces for them. It was really hard.
Yeah. And I do remember, members of the admission committee, noticing that you were having to turn away women who were more qualified than the men because there weren't enough slots for the women. So this goes on, this continued discrimination against women applicants. It's legal, as I said before. And then in your third year at Yale, a number of the members of the admissions committee decide to write a letter. And why don't you tell us about that?
Yes, and as it happened, the third round was in the fall because that year we tried some kind of an early admission process. And I think maybe because we weren't looking at so many candidates, the challenges were even starker. And 2 members of the 5 people assigned that had written previously, but I think they wrote privately or fairly privately. I just couldn't do that work anymore without saying something, because I cared a lot about Yale by then. I really thought it was a wonderful institution. And one of the things that was hard was that Kingman Brewster had been a real pioneer in increasing Yale's diversity in most respects. The number of Jews increased dramatically after Kingman became the president. He'd done a lot of outreach to get minority students. There still weren't very many, but a good many more than many colleges had at that time. But there we were with this clear, drastic limitation of how many women could be admitted to Yale. And so 5 of us wrote a letter, which was pretty strong. It happened that Kingman Brewster was on leave that fall, so the letter went to the the acting president. But I don't remember this part. I wish I did. We must have decided to make the decision to send it to the Yale Daily News because it appeared there, and of course got terrific support from the Yale Daily News and other student. There'd been a lot of student action on this front, but it just was hard to make progress. But it was so hard to see, to be part of Yale doing the wrong thing, and especially since some of the people most directly hurt by that were my kind of women.
Yeah. When you talked to me about writing this letter and really about this challenge of being one of the few women at Yale and trying to figure out when to speak up and when not to speak up. And can you talk to us a little bit more about that and what that challenge was like?
It just was something that came up all the time. And again, Anne mentioned that the women's movement was just getting underway. I think when I went to Yale, the only sort of public name for feminism at that point was Betty Friedan. But things started happening very fast. Consciousness raising groups were formed. Ms. Magazine came out about my 3rd or 4th year at Yale. And so there was a context in which a lot of women were kind of looking at their circumstances, and things that they'd kind of taken for granted or not thought would change suddenly became open for discussion. And there were a lot of people at Yale who just, I didn't very often get direct hostility, but there was a lot of thoughtlessness. Oh, we're going to talk about this, Ed. The freshman assembly, when I first came, is a very, very lovely ceremony to welcome the freshmen, and we got instructions about what to wear. And I was supposed to wear dark trousers and dark socks. And this was long before pantsuits, well, 3 or 4 years before pantsuits. So that kind of thing, things they just didn't think about. Talking about the Yale teams, which were the men's teams, and then the women's teams. But, the women's teams were Yale teams too, and they were doing better than the men's teams. So that kind of stuff, just all the time. We would call them microaggressions now. That phrase hadn't come out yet, but it certainly was a part of life there. And so often I'm just sort of struggling with, when to speak out bluntly. Anger was, first of all, I was brought up to be ladylike, so anger was not a comfortable emotion, and that was kind of tough in its own way. And it did not seem to be the useful weapon very often. But it was there, and we had to figure out how to handle it. I'll tell you this is a relatively trivial example, but it's a little bit like my first day and not being able to go to Maury's. I was asked to speak to several alumni groups, several times a year, because they were curious about coeducation and was there such a thing as a woman dean and so forth. And in Denver, we were going to the luncheon, and my host stopped dead because he'd suddenly realized it was a men's club and I would have to go up the back stairs. So, I thought, boy, is this a teaching moment? But I could not think of anything to say. I was just too angry. And, they got the point. They didn't do that again. But that kind of frustration when you have an opportunity and you can't quite figure out how to make the best use of it.
Well, it always seemed to me that both you and Elga Wasserman, so the other administrator I mentioned, were walking this narrow line between staying silent and therefore being part or feeling, I think, part of the problem or feeling ineffective, and speaking out and being shunted aside as an angry woman. And there was just that very little space in between and where you could act and feel effective.
Well, Elga and I could unload to each other. That helped.
Should we talk a little bit about Elga? We've got a little bit of time before we're going to open it up to questions. Would that be worth doing? Because I know a number of the women students also knew Elga well and felt very grateful for her. Why don't you tell us about Elga a little bit?
Well, she certainly was a trooper and a persistent. I mean, part of the discomfort that some of the men had with Elga was that she was persistent. She needed to be. Things weren't changing very fast, and there were a lot of issues that came up that people didn't take seriously. That many of the men wouldn't take seriously. So she had a really tough job. I personally found her to be a very warm, helpful person. When she was angry, I could always sympathize with why she was angry. And she got a lot more of that stuff than I did. So we were lucky to have her.
Yeah. Elga was the first woman to serve in the Yale president's office, although that was sort of a technicality because her office was actually 2 blocks away from the president's office. So it's not like she could walk into the president's office every day. And she was given the title of Special Assistant to the President for the Education of Women, which was one that put her off of the traditional hierarchy. So Betsy was quite interesting in that she had a job that men had had. It was a real job with a real path upward, or possibly a path upward.
Possibly.
I'm trying to be generous here. It was a title that was recognizable and not made up for a woman. Yeah,
that's true. And the reason I'm laughing is that Yale actually was very unusual. John Wilkinson, my boss, and I were among the very few people who were full-time administrators. Almost everybody else doing administrative work was also teaching classes or doing some other major responsibility, usually faculty members. So that was unusual in itself. And after 6 years at Yale, well, John had left, Elga had left, and I thought, so what do I do next? And I thought, there was no path that I saw that was appealing. So, and it was, I don't think primarily because I was a woman, it was primarily because I was not a scholar and a faculty member. I did not have a PhD and I wasn't planning to get one. So I went off to law school instead, thinking I might become a university lawyer, which I did, sort of.
And this is a point on which I will say Betsy and I disagree a little bit, because you're right, John Wilkinson didn't have a PhD, but he went on to become Secretary of Yale, which is one of the top 4 officers.
Not for a while, though.
Yeah, right. And same with, and the same with Sam Chauncey. So there were men put in very top administrative positions at Yale without doctorates and PhDs, and there were not women who were elevated that way for many, many years. I wanted to tell a little more before we open it up to questions about what happens after you and the other 4 admissions committee members write that letter saying how Yale's gender quotas and the position it puts you in are, I think the words were distressing and unjust. They're very, very strong words in that letter. I should, if you've got the book.
I've got it. I've got the letter right here somewhere.
Oh, great. Yeah. I mean, the letter, this was a powerful letter. And as Betsy said.
Mine is, I did use words like anguishing for us and so on and so forth, but the last line is to continue to offer women only the spaces available after filling the quota of 1,025 men. I forgot the 25. And to deny admission to hundreds of Yale's strongest applicants is seriously to weaken Yale's commitment to coeducation and equality. And then the acting president, of course, I mean, nothing happens. Few things happened fast at Yale. The corporation took it up almost a year later, but here's the funny thing. My memory was that it was at least several years before there was any improvement in the number of women who were admitted. But in fact, it was in my 4th year, I think.
That they lift the quota.
My 5th year, it must have been my 5th year, but still.
Yeah, and that letter is really
we went from 230 to 400 and something.
Yeah. That letter is really a critical moment because students have been protesting Yale's gender quotas right from the start. And President Brewster had said to the students, if you've got something you're upset about, give me a petition. And so that's what they did. And they went out and initially more than half of the student body, and then the number is rising to 2/3 of the student body. They're getting thousands of signatures on this petition telling Yale to have a 50-50 admissions process. And at first it's a group of women called the Yale Sisterhood that organized this. And then it becomes a co-ed group that's doing it. And it's into that moment that your letter arrives, and it adds this huge punch from the status quo, the administrators and faculty at Yale who are doing the admissions, who support this view that these quotas are unjust. And what happens from there is that Yale's minister, Reverend Sloan Coffin, who had been absolutely mute on this discrimination against women. He was well known in his opposition to the Vietnam War, well known in his opposition and stands against racism, but had been mute about Yale's discrimination against women. This letter galvanizes him, and he gives a sermon on the immorality of Yale's policy. And he's very tight with Yale's president, Kingman Brewster, who is often in the pews when Coffin is speaking. And that is very uncomfortable for Brewster, having his ally and friend call him out on this sexism. And so that letter really galvanizes some of the adult voices at Yale to push this change as well. So the students had been activists all along, but the faculty, shockingly, I think, had remained silent and never takes a faculty vote on this until it's so late that it's irrelevant. So the faculty sort of absents itself. The faculty as a whole, individual faculty members speak out, but the faculty as a whole does not take a stand on this. So I'm looking at our time, and Charlie, I'm gonna turn it back to you to field questions for me or for Betsy, because we've promised our audience some time to do that. And we've got about 20 minutes left.
Betsy, I just wanted to ask, would you do it over again? And if you did, how would you do it differently?
Oh my, yes, I would do. I mean, I am very grateful to have had that experience. As I said, I really came to love Yale. And there were just wonderful people I met there, both faculty members and students. There are things that I think, well, there's been some scholarship about these transitions. In addition, Stan, I want to mention, by the way, that Anne's dissertation is the first thing she wrote before the book. It's called Unescorted Guests, which is a fine title for the circumstance we found ourselves in. And it's very interesting. It's more, more wonky than the book, of course. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot from it. I know things about what was happening at Yale when I was there now that I didn't know then. And it's a little hard sometimes to separate my memory from what I've learned from reading Anne's dissertation in her book. But there's also a book by a woman named Nancy Malkiel called Keep the Damn Women Out. And she talks about most of the Ivy League institutions as they made this change. I wish we had done much more to help the women get together, because they were so few of them in each of, at one point they wanted to put the women in one college so they'd be a sort of, a group that could be a community. But none of the colleges wanted to be a college without any women in it. So they ended up having a fairly small number of women in each of the residential colleges. And especially at the 50th anniversary discussion, again and again, we heard people comment on how tough that was. If you were a junior woman, you'd probably do the 10 women in your college and not very many of the others. I wish we had understood better the challenges of people who are the first in their family to go to college. First generation kids. That's a need that we didn't recognize sufficiently at the time. And I would add too that things like the African American, I forget exactly what it's called, Anne knows. I mean, we were only beginning colleges were only beginning to provide those sort of identity specific settings for people to get to know each other.
Just sort of a quick comment on two of those things. So 1969 is a very important year at Yale for African American students as well. Yale begins offering one of the earliest Afro-American studies majors in the country. And that happened because of the activism of Yale's Black students, who were just a handful back then, and their very good relationship with Kingman Brewster. It's also the first year that the Afro-Am House opens, and so there's a place for Black students to go. And as Skip Gates, who arrived at Yale in the fall of 1969 as a student, observed, that entering class that year was the blackest class Yale had ever allowed in. So there are rising numbers, but of course, so the women were 13% of the student body. The African-American women were 1% of the student body. There were just 40 of them across the entire college. And so that position as isolated and other is, felt tenfold by the African-American women. The Asian American women, there were just 13 across the college, and there are only 3 Latina women in all of Yale College, 1 freshman, 1 sophomore, 1 junior.
Yeah, we called them Chicanas back then.
Yeah, there were Chicana. Yeah, we didn't use Latina. There was a Chicana student group, and there was a Puerto Rican student group, and those were the identities which they identified.
And actually, speaking of languages, I was sort of reviewing things and thinking about this. I was really struck by a lot of phrases we use now that we didn't use then. For example, the discussion about improving the admissions policy was to have sex-blind admissions. Well, of course, you can't really have sex-blind admissions. Gender neutral is a term that came along a lot later. Anne mentioned sexism being a new word. I have a very distinct memory of hearing that word for the first time while I was at Yale, my first or second year, I think. And there's just so much of that kind of, we have made progress in intercultural sensitivities, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It was just, if you compare where we are now to where we were then.
Dorothy Waldron has a question.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering if you have any insight into the institutional process Yale went through, because it must have been, the board of trustees or whoever made the decision, what the process looked like and what impediments they ran into, how they overcame them, what the process was like. I don't know whether Betsy, you came when it happened. Did you hear any anecdotes about that process?
You're breaking up. You're breaking up, but I think you were asking about the process of starting coeducation or the process of.
Yeah, when did it start? What precipitated it? And,
we'll
how
do this very quickly.
Yeah,
we'll do this quickly, and Anne can do it in more detail. But basically, Yale first thought that maybe they'd get Vassar to come down and be a coordinate college, and that idea didn't go over very well either at Yale or at Vassar. What I know now that I didn't know when I went was that the decision to admit women was not because they thought women should have a fair chance at a good Yale education. It was because the best men were going to other colleges that were coeducational. And that was true at Princeton too. And both Princeton and Yale made the decision on very quickly. Princeton actually accepted applications from women before they decided for sure that they were going to admit women that fall. But Princeton had done some serious preparation with research studies and talking to alumni and, thinking about it in a sort of elaborate way. The Yale, if you read Anne's dissertation, you'll learn more about it. It's quite amazing that it came to pass pretty smoothly, all things considered, considering how little time they had for preparation. When was the decision made, Anne? It was like November the previous year?
Yeah, so Yale, and as Betsy says, and Yale's top competitor and the way it sees the world at that point is, what is Harvard doing? And Yale is seeing the numbers of students who were turning Yale down for Harvard increase. And when they did follow-up studies, the guys would say, well, at Harvard, if I want to get a good date, I just have to turn to the Radcliffe girl sitting next to me in class and ask her out, or I can drive 20 minutes to Wellesley. But at Yale, I have to drive 2 hours to Smith or Mount Holyoke. Now, of course, there's a whole class thing in that as well, because there were other colleges in New Haven, but they weren't the right colleges and the right women. And so Yale sort of sees the writing on the wall that if it wants to keep attracting the top students, those top students want to go to co-ed schools. And so that's what happens. To be honest, when I was a student there, I follow these women. I had assumed that it had something to do with the women's movement, and so I was shocked when I found out that it wasn't, that they were all reading The Feminine Mystique and thinking, oh my God, we should have let women in, but that's not what happens.
Karen, Garvin, please.
Yes, I have a question for Anne. Anne, your dissertation and your book have certainly provided really interesting and informative ideas, and have given us a lot of information. I'm wondering, for you personally, where is that going to take you next? Do you have a path that you're going to follow up on these two areas?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I guess to answer it, I should also start by saying a little bit about why I decided to write Yale Needs Women. And as Joy mentioned, I'd never written a book before. And I was getting my doctorate and sort of had a throwaway paper in a required class on higher education history. I'd been a history major at Yale and had taught history, but I wasn't planning to focus my dissertation on history. And so I decided to write a paper about these first women students at Yale because I didn't know anything about them. And when I went to the books that had already been written about Yale, Yale's of course a very prominent school, none of them had bothered to talk to any of the women about what it was like for Yale to go co-ed. And this shocked me. And I was working at the time as an associate commissioner of academics in Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. I took a day off of work and I drove to New Haven. It's just 2 hours from Boston because I figured, well, the primary sources have to be there. And Yale has this beautiful collection of oral histories from this period. And of the 103 students, faculty, and administrators during this period of coeducation that had interviews at Yale, just 3 were women. One of them was Elga Wasserman. One of them was the woman who'd come in to run athletics, and one of them was the wife of the president who preceded Kingman Brewster. And so at that point, I think I just sort of had I guess as I say, the bit in my mouth. And I thought, this is a story I can tell. This is outrageous that the story of coeducation is being told totally from the perspective of the men. And I eventually quit my job to write my book, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. That said, I sort of feel like I said what I have to say about this transition to coeducation. I am sort of playing around with a new book idea and have been doing research for the last month or two, but it's not about Yale, and we'll see where it goes. So.
We'll be looking for it.
Thanks, Karen.
Cynthia Perkins, please.
Yes, hi. Betsy, I have a question for you. You were hired to do a job, and I'm wondering how all these policies and sort of unspoken norms at the time impacted your ability to do the job you were hired to do, and how that changed over the course of your time there.
I guess it depends on how you define the job.
Okay.
To the extent my job was to improve things for women at Yale, as I mentioned, there are things I wish we had done that it felt like we couldn't do a lot that needed to be done. But I also think, when I was being interviewed for the job, I asked, what the responsibilities might be. And they basically said, well, we'll figure it out, when we get the person in the role. Let's find out, what she is good at doing and would enjoy doing and so forth. And so, for example, I didn't often feel that the kind of impediment you described. I was, in effect, a freshman counselor. I chose the freshman, I'm sorry, basically a dean of freshmen, although they're called first-year students now. And I chose the freshman counselors. I prepared the information packets that they got. We put together a sort of orientation program for freshmen and things like that. And so that was one of my big responsibilities. I was on a lot of committees. Anne had told me when we first met that she had read about me in the archives first. It had not occurred to me that I was in the archives. She sent me the index of what's under my name in the archives. It's 5 pages long. It lists a great many committees I was on. I'd forgotten I was on that many committees, but as I mentioned before, most committees wanted to have a woman, and there were very few of us available for that kind of a role. So in a sense, I think, you know, it gave me opportunities to meet a lot of different kinds of people in the university that I might not otherwise have met. Like the head of the police department, for example, was a terrific guy, and he was thrilled that somebody also believed that fire drills were important. When I was in college, fire drills were taken very seriously, and Yale had been kind of casual about them. That, you know, variety of stuff.
I want to pitch in on that, on one thing to follow Joy's advice, to toot your horn a little bit. And one of the big reams of memos I'd found that Betsy had written, that I read before I met her, and which she doesn't recall that much, but is documented in the archives, is a persistent voice trying to improve the security and safety of Yale women. So Yale had been pretty casual about safety when it was an all-male college in terms of lack of lighting, lack of locks. And in that first fall in particular, one of the things that's going on is women would be taking a shower at Yale, and because Yale was wide open and it was widely publicized that these first women were there, strangers would walk into the women's bathroom where it's just a plastic shower curtain while they were showering. Or there's a memo from Betsy to the top security guy talking about one of the bathrooms in the freshman women's dorm where there was a hatch above, and the women would look up and see teenage kids from New Haven peering down at them while they were taking their shower. So she was a persistent voice of memo after memo after memo, trying to get Yale to pay attention to safety and security of its women students. So
yeah, there's a struggle to set up shuttle buses and things like that.
Yeah.
I have a slightly different perspective, if I could just add it at the very end. We've had technical difficulties, so we've been zooming in and out, and I don't know whether it's redundant, but my father taught in the history and political science department for quite a while at Yale, and he had 1 year of coeducation. And he said he was so happy that he got to that point because first he had 2 daughters, but also because the male students that he had in his seminars were much better prepared, and they were cleaner than when it was not co-ed. So I don't know if other faculty members felt that way, but my father was very convinced of the good of having co-education.
Well, I remember going to maybe a 25th or something, the anniversary of undergraduate co-education, and the faculty members said that the quality of the classroom discussion went up terrifically once it became co-educational. The women, basically, you've got the statistics, and they outperformed the men, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I can't resist throwing this in right now, but during the first 4 years of coeducation at Yale, every single semester, the women students outperformed the men academically. So even with all the challenges they faced, and both personal and in some of their cases of having every Yale man want to go out with them, and the phone constantly ringing and them constantly being asked out, to some facing harassment and worse, they still managed to really shine academically at Yale. So that was impressive to me.
Lisa?
Thank you, Andy, for making that point. My question actually has to do with Yale and leadership, and I'm curious, Yale was the second school to go co-ed of the Ivies. To what extent did some of the changes made at Yale perhaps get mimicked or adopted by other institutions? How quickly was Yale leading the charge, or was it really sort of constantly following the charge, hopefully not always behind Harvard?
Is that Lisa Patukian? That's my college roommate, my freshman year roommate. We've exchanged notes, but we haven't seen each other in a long time.
You have to have a Zoom call for this.
I know, it's really nice to see you. So Cornell is the first of the Ivy Leagues to be co-ed. It opens about 100 to 200 years later than the other Ivy League schools, at a time when the bulk of American colleges are becoming co-ed, and Cornell is also west enough, it's off of that East Coast elitism belt, that it begins as co-ed. So then Yale announces it's going co-ed. Princeton, of course, quickly follows, because it doesn't want to be of the top, what were the top three then, the one that doesn't take women. One of the things I loved that I found in the archives was a study that Dartmouth did. So Dartmouth was all male, and like Yale and Princeton, had never even had a sister school. So there were the men there, like those at Yale and Princeton, had never even gone to class with women. And Dartmouth did a big study of coeducation at Yale and Princeton. They had access to all of the budget numbers and interviewed the trustees, and concludes that coeducation is a great thing, in part because it's a huge moneymaker. Because as Betsy said, Yale didn't build any more dorms. The number of faculty at Yale, in fact, decreases after the number of women arrive. And so, just in terms of Yale's taking in all of these women's tuitions with barely any increased expenses. And so this is a time when colleges in this country are under huge financial strain. Yale makes $2 million off of those first women students in the first couple of years. And Dartmouth looks at those numbers and comes up with this idea of going to a year-round schedule. And but it was that financial aspect of it that really starts to lead. Now, when you talk about leading, what does it mean to lead in coeducation? Is it the gender ratio? Is it the number of women faculty? The scarcity of women faculty was true at Princeton and Harvard as well. Yale, in terms of its administration and trustees, I don't think we could call a leader. Yale women students are national leaders. So that the term sexual harassment had not been coined yet when coeducation starts at Yale. It's a group of Yale women who coined that phrase for the very first time in May of 1971 in a complaint that they filed with the federal government against Yale. Yale's women students pushed Yale, and helped by Elga Wasserman, and sort of through a loophole in the curriculum into having women's studies courses. Yale's women students are, Roe v. Wade hasn't been ruled yet when women start at Yale, and Yale's women students are active in trying to overturn and successfully overturning Connecticut's anti-abortion law, which was one of the harshest in the nation. So Yale's women students are leaders. I don't think we could say that Yale itself was.
Laura, Kramer?
Hi. So I just want to thank Anne for writing the book, which my friend Patty Ruse sent. I think you know her, and
yeah.
I overlapped with you at Yale as well, although I didn't know you there. And I want to thank Betsy for leading the way. I've known Betsy now for a long time, and reading the book really brought it home how much happened that I was completely unaware of. I entered in 1976, and a lot of this had gone away. It was just fine as far as I mean, yes, some minor things happened, and that's a whole other discussion, but by and large, it went very smoothly. And we even had co-ed dorms and co-ed bathrooms. And, you know, when I read this book, I was like, wow, that happened really quickly once it started to happen. So thank you both. That's all.
That's terrific. And we're at 7 o'clock. So Karen,
We
did
have,
you?
we have one more. If we
Okay.
could Get Patricia in. All right, see if I can get you unmuted, Patricia. There you go.
Thank you. Hi, Patricia Sheppard, class of 74. So, and we've had some conversation by email, and we'll still have lunch. Maybe Betsy can join us too. Right. I think, you know, one untold story is the story of sexual harassment of the women at Yale in those classes. And I actually, in the current Yale Alumni Magazine, I wrote a letter that I, you know, I've never done anything quite like this before, but it was about Harold Bloom. And when he, after his death in the fall, there was this, you know, there was an article about him praising his work and so forth. And he, you know, really pursued relentlessly several women that I know. He pursued me, but I cut him short. But it was really awful. And sort of the idea was almost like, you know, I can make your career sort of thing. You know, it was really pretty awful. And I suggest that as a further, you know, story of the women there at that time. So with that, I'll end.
I'm sorry you had to go through that. And I,
Well,
you know, I think that
if you read my response to him, it's in the letters. It's just one letter, and I think I took care of him. So,
yeah.
Well,
And
I'm sad to hear that story too, but I don't think this is just failing memory. I think we didn't hear much about that. I mean, at least I didn't hear much about that kind of a situation. I think the women students were reluctant to speak, even to Elga and me about.
absolutely, you know.
Yeah, and that is something that came up in
Mm-hmm.
quite a few of the interviews that I did, and the response of the women often was, you know, this was a time when if you were targeted like that, it was assumed it was your fault as the woman. There was something that you were doing wrong, and the stigma was going to attach to the woman and not to the man. And there was a sense that Yale was not going to do anything about it. And so many of the women did not go to the university because it was not a logical thing to do in terms of the cost and potential benefit.
And the age of the women,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, 17, 18. I was a little older because of other circumstances, but yeah, I think the age was a very big factor too.
Yeah.
I would like to end on something more positive. And I think so many women came, I was one of them in this respect too, with a sense of adventure. And it was challenging in ways that we often hadn't anticipated, but it is just, it was wonderful to see how women were coping with this very demanding situation. And as you said, Patricia, you know, at 17 and 18 and 19, I was 31. I didn't feel very old, but at least I had some experience behind me that made it easier for me in many ways than it was for the students.
Well, I want to thank Anne and Betsy for a fabulous conversation. I think we've all enjoyed their remarks and have some insight into that age, and certainly some of those issues still continue with us today. I also want to thank you folks for being an engaged and attentive audience. I thank you again for being here, and again, thank you to Betsy and to Anne. And Charlie for keeping us on target here.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.